No one really knows when memory began, only that one day the earth started speaking back. Somewhere between the silence of the rivers and the heat of the plain, hands pressed signs into wet clay. When they dried, those markings refused to fade. Thousands of years later, we call them Sumerian tablets. But to the people who made them, perhaps they were not records at all. Perhaps they were an attempt to trap something that was already slipping away. So before you let yourself sink too deeply into the dark, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. And as always, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. They say civilization began in Sumer, where the Tigris and Euphrates bend like the ribs of a sleeping animal. Yet the first stories carved into clay did not begin with men, but with kings who were not entirely human. The Sumerian king list names rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years, numbers that defy reason, but refuse to be dismissed. Alulim, who ruled Eridu for 28,000 years. Alaulgar, for 36,000. 8 kings before the flood, their reigns stretching across a span of time longer than all recorded history combined. Archaeologists faced with these absurd durations called them myths. Historians called them symbols. But clay, indifferent to belief, remembers what it was told. The tablets say there was a flood, and after it the kingship descended from heaven once more. The phrase is repeated like a ritual: the kingship descended from heaven. Not was given, not was earned. Descended. A word heavy with motion, with gravity, as if sovereignty itself had fallen from the sky. Scholars have long debated whether this line was poetic metaphor or literal memory. But in Sumerian thought, heaven was not merely a place above, it was a dimension of order, a realm of beings whose actions set the rhythm of existence below. The descent of kingship may have been the descent of knowledge, or of flesh that remembered another form. Beneath the sands of Iraq, archaeologists uncovered layer upon layer of cities built atop one another: Eridu, Uruk, Kish, each rising from the ruins of the last, as if every generation tried to rebuild the memory of something it could no longer quite recall. The lowest levels, the oldest ones, are often found beneath layers of silt, evidence of catastrophic flooding. The story of Utnapishtim, who survived a divine deluge in the Epic of Gilgamesh, echoes the same pattern found in Genesis, in the tale of Noah. Across continents, the story repeats: a civilization erased, a chosen remnant saved, a new beginning written upon the remnants of the old. And yet, even in these earliest tablets, there is a strange confidence, an awareness of events that seem far older than they should. The Sumerians wrote about the arrangement of the stars, about the paths of planets invisible to the naked eye. They charted the movements of Venus and Jupiter with a precision not rediscovered until millennia later. They knew that the moon's cycles governed tides and fertility, that time itself was a sacred rhythm to be measured and named. How could a people so newly emerged from prehistory hold knowledge that should have taken centuries of observation? Perhaps, as some scholars quietly wondered, they did not discover it. They remembered it. In the 19th century, when the first cuneiform tablets were translated, many of the translators refused to believe what they read. The ages were too long, the gods too numerous, the flood too familiar. It was as if the Sumerians were recounting a story already known, but from an angle slightly askew. George Smith, the British Assyriologist who first recognized the flood story on a fragment of clay, was said to have leapt from his seat in astonishment. The myths of the Bible, it seemed, were not original. They were echoes of something older. The clay had spoken before parchment ever existed. Some researchers proposed that the numbers on the king list were symbolic, representing lunar months or sacred numerology. Others suggested transcription errors or exaggerations meant to glorify ancient rulers. But even after every correction, the reign still stretched across impossible spans. The list did not behave like mythology. It behaved like memory distorted by distance. When you peer too far into deep time, Even truth begins to look like allegory. If the first kings were divine, what did that divinity mean? The Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki, great beings who came from the heavens to shape the destinies of men. In some texts they are judges, in others, architects of life itself. The god Enki, patron of wisdom and creation, fashioned humans from clay mixed with divine essence to relieve the gods of labor. The act of creation was not love, but utility. And yet, buried within that myth is the haunting suggestion that humanity was engineered for purpose, crafted to serve, then left to inherit a world not truly its own. To hold one of those tablets, archaeologists say, is to feel time compress. The marks are crude, yet deliberate, as if written by someone who knew their words would outlast every temple, every breath. Each wedge pressed into clay is an act of defiance against forgetting. When the cities burned and empires collapsed, the clay endured. Thousands of years later, when modern hands brushed away the dust, the story resumed mid-sentence, as though history had merely paused for breath. And in that breath lies the real mystery. Every civilization believes it is the first to awaken, yet every ruin whispers otherwise. The Sumerians called themselves the black-headed people, born of the gods' design. But what of those before them, those whose names are missing from the king list, erased by the flood, forgotten by the clay? Did they too build, worship, and vanish? Or were they something else entirely, creatures of an older design, a failed draft of what would become us? When night falls over the ancient plains, and the wind moves through the reeds along the Euphrates, it sounds almost like voices speaking in a language no one remembers. Perhaps that is the true meaning of civilization, the echo that refuses to fade. The clay remembers, even when we do not. If history begins with a flood, what drowned before memory began? In the half-light between myth and memory, the Sumerian tablets whisper of a creation that was not divine in the gentle sense, but surgical, deliberate, almost transactional. The story tells of gods who grew weary of their own labor, of beings too powerful to toil under the sun, who gathered in council and conceived a plan, to shape servants who would bear their burdens. These servants, they said, would be made of clay, yet infused with something far more precious, blood, the essence of the gods themselves. It was not life they were granting, but function. And from that strange covenant between dust and divinity, humanity began. Modern scholars call it mythology. Yet when the tablets are read closely, when the breath of the cuneiform marks is traced like veins, they begin to sound less like poems and more like records. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods mix clay with the blood of a slain deity to form humankind. The text even describes the process as if it were a ritual of fabrication. Clay, molded in the womb of the goddess, stirred with the flesh of the divine, producing beings capable of work and thought. The act is not metaphorical, it is anatomical. There is a precision to the language that makes one uneasy. The Sumerians, it seems, did not imagine their creation. They remembered it. Across the world, other civilizations echo this strange synthesis of matter and spirit. In Egypt, Khnum forms man on a potter's wheel from Nile mud. In Genesis, Yahweh shapes Adam from the dust of the ground. In the Popol Vuh of the Maya, the gods fashion humans first from mud, then from wood, and finally from maize, the grain that endures. Everywhere, the idea repeats: life molded by hand, adjusted through failure, refined through trial. But only the Sumerian version speaks of blood, of sacrifice as ingredient, not symbol. What do they mean by that? Some geneticists, looking at the human genome's sudden leap in complexity, have noted anomalies they can't entirely explain. A handful of evolutionary biologists, careful not to cross into speculation, have quietly referred to what they call punctuated equilibrium, a sudden, accelerated phase of genetic change. It happened around 200,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens emerged with language capacity, abstract reasoning, and a neurological architecture distinct from any ancestor before. To the Sumerian mind, this might not have been evolution, but intervention. Their myth, read through modern eyes, could almost describe the editing of a species, an ancient memory of genetic inheritance disguised as theology. The Anunnaki, those watchful lords of heaven and earth, were said to have descended in groups, each with a role: Enki the wise, Enlil the enforcer, Ninhursag the mother who molded forms. They worked not with miracles but with intention. The texts say that when the first human prototypes failed, when their bodies would not hold or their minds would not obey, the gods altered the mixture, added more of their essence, and began again. The imagery is chillingly clinical. It is as if the Sumerians remembered their own genesis not as a gift but as an experiment. And yet within the same myths there lingers compassion. Enki, the trickster and creator, defies his brother's decree to destroy humanity when their noise becomes unbearable. He instructs Atrahasis to build a vessel to survive the deluge that would cleanse the world. In this act, rebellion and mercy coexist. The God who made mankind also saves it. Perhaps that too is a form of guilt, an acknowledgement that creation carries consequence. In temple reliefs and cylinder seals, beings with wings, horns, and strange instruments stand beside men who kneel. The proportions are off. The gods tower, the heads elongated, their eyes vast and unblinking. The Sumerians carved them with precision, not imagination. Were these gods divine archetypes, or memories of another species? Early 20th century archaeologists unearthed skulls in southern Mesopotamia with unnatural cranial elongations, later dismissed as ritual modification. But in the dim vaults of museum storage rooms, such bones remain unsettling. They seem both human and not. Language, too, carries traces of this inheritance. The word Adarmu in Sumerian means to make or to mold. The Hebrew Adam, likely drawn from it, means of the ground. In both, there is the idea of fabrication rather than birth. Humanity is an artifact. When the Sumerians spoke of races, they did not refer to color or tribe, but lineage, those who bore more of the divine mixture, and those who bore less. Priests, kings, and temple workers were categorized by proximity to that essence. In time, those distinctions would harden into class, bloodline, and myth of chosen peoples. But perhaps their origin was not social at all. Perhaps it was biological. In the dim chambers of the Temple of Eridu, where Enki's cult once sang hymns to the god of the deep, the word Abzu was carved repeatedly. It means the abyss, but also the source. To the Sumerians, the Abzu was both a body of water and a metaphysical realm, a deep underworld where life began. Archaeologists often interpret it as a metaphor for groundwater, but in the myths, it is from the Abzu that the gods retrieved the clay to create man. If taken literally, it suggests a place beneath the earth, a laboratory of the gods, a cradle carved in darkness. The myth grows stranger the longer one lingers in it. For in later texts, when humanity multiplies beyond measure, the gods grow restless. They send drought, famine, and disease to quiet the noise. When that fails, they decide to erase their creation entirely. Only one man, Atrahasis, is warned, told to preserve the seed of life aboard a vessel sealed against the flood. The story is older than Noah by centuries, older than Moses by millennia, and yet it ends the same way, with a covenant, a rainbow, a promise. Except here, the promise feels less like forgiveness and more like resignation. When the waters recede, the gods return. They grant humans shorter lives, fragile bodies, and minds that forget. The gift of mortality, they call it, a mercy and a restraint. The Sumerians believed memory itself was once longer, deeper, perhaps eternal. The first humans may have remembered their makers, the new ones would not. And so the record was sealed in clay, left for those far in the future. those who might one day rediscover what was lost. We read these stories now through the lens of metaphor, afraid of what might happen if we took them seriously. Yet their precision lingers like a code. Clay, blood, instruction, form, correction, erasure. It feels less like religion and more like recursion, the echo of creation itself repeating across ages. If our myths are memories, then perhaps we too are living translations of something older, speaking in symbols we barely understand. The fire of the gods was not light, but knowledge, and once it touched flesh, it burned forever. So what if creation was never a beginning, but a continuation, one more link in an unending experiment? And if that's true, who or what is still watching the results unfold? There is something deeply unsettling about a language that has no mother and no child. The Sumerian tongue stands alone in the world, an orphan of speech, without ancestors to trace and without descendants to inherit. Linguists call it a language isolate, as if that label explained the silence surrounding it. But isolation is not explanation, it is merely description. The truth is that no one knows where Sumerian came from. It appeared suddenly, fully formed around the same time writing itself was invented. It did not evolve from simpler scripts, nor did it borrow from neighbors who might have inspired it. It was as if, one day, the people of the southern plains simply began to write, and what they wrote was already ancient. When scholars first deciphered the wedge-shaped marks, they expected to find a primitive tongue, a proto-language still learning to think. Instead, they found grammar more intricate than their own, full of subtle tones, complex verb chains, and levels of politeness that revealed an entire philosophy of being. Sumerian verbs could express not just action, but intention, emotion, and moral alignment. The word order shifted like breath, precise and melodic, suggesting a consciousness both mathematical and poetic. How does such complexity emerge without precedent? Some linguists have proposed that Sumerian may have been a remnant of an earlier linguistic world, a survival from a civilization erased before the known timeline. They compare it to an island language left behind after a continent sank beneath the sea. Others argue that its structure resembles no human pattern at all, as if it had been constructed rather than evolved. This idea, uncomfortably close to artifice, unsettles the academic mind. For a language to exist without lineage challenges not just linguistics, but history itself. It suggests that culture can appear ex nihilo, that memory can be inherited from somewhere other than the past. In the dim archives of the British Museum, thousands of clay tablets remain untranslated, their Sumerian lines still pressed in ancient rhythm. Some contain hymns, others contracts or astronomical records, but a few are stranger. These are lists of sounds, phonetic exercises, as if someone was teaching an alien tongue to a population unfamiliar with it. The words repeat like mantras, ana, bana, gana. The purpose of these drills remains uncertain. Were they lessons for scribes, or something more primal, an attempt to preserve a dying language by inscribing its phonetic code into eternity? A fragment discovered in the ruins of Nippur speaks of words that bind heaven and earth. The tablet refers to a time when all humans shared a single speech, before divine intervention confused their tongues. Scholars often associate it with the biblical Tower of Babel, itself a likely echo of Sumerian myth. But what if the story of Babel is not about arrogance, but about loss? Perhaps there truly was one language once, a mother tongue of consciousness, fractured deliberately so that humanity would never again speak with one mind. The Sumerians believed that words carried power beyond their meaning. To name a thing was to bind it, to call its essence into being. Their priests recited hymns that were less prayer than incantation, sound patterns meant to alter reality itself. The word me, often translated as divine law, also means vibration or command. The gods held the me, the patterns of the universe encoded as speech. To speak them correctly was to reawaken creation. In that sense, language was not invention but inheritance, a frequency passed down from those who shaped the first humans from clay and blood. Modern physicists, in their own language of equations, describe a universe composed of vibrations, strings resonating in dimensions beyond sight. It is difficult not to hear in this the faint echo of Sumerian belief that the world is made of sound, and sound, arranged correctly, can reshape the world. Perhaps the first language was not spoken but heard, vibrating through the bones of the earth, a song that instructed clay how to move. When Enmelka, one of the early kings of Uruk, sought to rebuild communication with the distant city of Arata, he invoked Inanna, goddess of wisdom, to restore the one tongue of all lands. The poem that tells this story, written nearly 5,000 years ago, ends abruptly. The wish is made, the prayer offered, and then silence. The original tablet is broken, its last lines missing. The gap feels deliberate, as if the answer was never meant to be known. Some researchers have noticed mathematical sequences embedded in Sumerian cuneiform, the repetition of numbers corresponding to harmonic intervals. The same patterns appear in temple layouts, in the spacing of ziggurat steps, even in the tuning of ancient lyres excavated from royal graves. Language, architecture, and music shared a common geometry. It is as though the Sumerians were encoding knowledge in multiple dimensions, ensuring that even if one form was lost, another could sing it back into being. In the late 20th century, a few independent scholars attempted to reconstruct Sumerian pronunciation using computer models of phonetics. What they found was unexpected. When Sumerian was spoken aloud, with its original vowel tones restored, it produced resonant frequencies close to those known to affect brainwave states. Monks chanting, whales calling, temples humming, all share those same frequencies. It raises an eerie thought. Maybe the Sumerian language was designed not just to communicate, but to resonate with the human nervous system, to tune consciousness itself. The question of who created such a language, if created is even the right word, remains unanswered. But the myths offer a clue. The god Enki, lord of the Abzu, was also master of speech. He gave humanity the name Shub, the gift of articulation, allowing them to shape sound into thought. Yet he also used that gift to sow confusion among the gods' creations, scattering their unity. In one myth, Enki releases the Namshub of confusion, a spell that fragments language and thought, dividing humankind. The parallel to Babel is unmistakable. It suggests that the loss of linguistic unity was not a punishment, but an intentional act of control. If that is true, then what we call language evolution might be something else entirely. A managed forgetting. Every language since Sumerian could be a broken shard of a single, greater code. Every word we speak might be an echo of a sound that once commanded worlds. Even now, some fragments of Sumerian phrases defy translation. They seem too dense, too layered, containing meanings that shift depending on who reads them. Linguists call these polysemic constructs, but perhaps that term hides a more uncomfortable truth, that Sumerian is not meant to be fully understood. It was built to conceal as much as it revealed, like the genome of a species with dormant instructions waiting to awaken. When you listen to recordings of Sumerian being recited aloud, those deep rhythmic syllables rising and falling like waves, you feel something move behind the ribs. It is not comprehension, but recognition. As if the body remembers a sound the mind has forgotten, a language that shouldn't exist yet refuses to die. Maybe that's the real secret of Sumerian. It is not a relic of the past, but a reminder, an unbroken tone vibrating beneath history, waiting for someone to remember how to listen. Beneath the sands of the southern plain, under the steppe shadow of ancient ziggurats, bones sleep that do not quite belong to us. When archaeologists first began digging at Ur, Eridu, and Kish in the early 20th century, they expected the familiar remnants of early humanity. Simple tools, pottery, the relics of common life. What they found instead was skulls elongated like vases, with cranial volumes exceeding modern human averages by unsettling margins. Some bore trepanation scars, small circular holes perfectly carved into the bone, not by accident but by intention. In one sealed tomb, beneath layers of bitumen, they found a skeleton taller than the rest, its limbs proportioned strangely, as though built for a gravity slightly weaker than Earth's own. The museum reports recorded these finds in cautious language. Unusual morphology, ritual modification, post-burial distortion. But a few field notes, never meant for publication, tell a different story. Sir Leonard Woolley, who excavated the Royal Cemetery of Ur in the 1920s, once wrote in his private correspondence that some skulls seemed beyond classification. He attributed the shapes to ritual binding, yet confessed that several showed no signs of deformation at all. Their elongation was internal, not cosmetic. The sutures along the crown were fused differently, suggesting a developmental rather than cultural cause. Later, such remarks were quietly excised from official accounts. The bones, catalogued, boxed, and shipped to London, vanished into the anonymous shelves of storage rooms that few now enter. The ziggurats themselves stand as layered memories of something older. Each generation built upon the ruins of the last, raising the temples higher toward the sky, as if to preserve alignment with something that kept receding. Beneath the visible layers, archaeologists discovered foundations of a much earlier architecture, cut into the clay with geometric precision. Some of those foundations contain burial vaults, rooms that were never meant for worship but for concealment. Within them lie bodies arranged not as humans bury their dead, but as if they were specimens placed for study. The Sumerians believed that their kings descended from heaven. In the king list, after the flood, kingship descended again from heaven and came to Kish. The word descended appears again and again, echoing through the centuries like an accusation. It suggests arrival, not succession. Some researchers, reading the ancient myths through modern eyes, wonder if those descents might have been literal, arrivals from the sky, bearing knowledge and form alien to the earth. If that sounds too bold, consider the recurring symbolism carved into the stone. Winged figures carrying small mechanical-looking objects, discs hovering above altars, spirals of stars descending into hands. To the Sumerians, these were not gods of imagination but memory. The bones buried beneath the Ziggurat of Ur bear traces of a race that may have predated us, or perhaps coexisted with us before being absorbed, diluted, or erased. Genetic studies on Mesopotamian remains, limited as they are by contamination and politics, have occasionally produced anomalies, mitochondrial lineages that appear abruptly and vanish just as quickly. Some alleles found in early Sumerian samples have no clear match among neighboring populations. The data are sparse, but they whisper the same refrain as the tablets. Something here does not belong. If the Sumerians were the first to record history, what did they mean when they said kingship descended? The myth of Atarna, one of their earliest kings, tells of a man who flew to heaven on the back of an eagle to retrieve the plant of birth, a symbol of divine right. The tale reads like dream, yet its imagery, ascension, air travel, the mingling of man and sky, haunts with mechanical undertones. The eagle is not a metaphor for spirit. It is a vessel. Etarna's journey feels almost technological, a memory retold through the only vocabulary available to the ancient mind. Deep below Ur, in strata older than the flood deposits, excavators found burned soil and vitrified fragments, clay that had been melted at temperatures higher than any primitive furnace could produce. The composition suggests exposure to extreme heat, instantaneous and localized. Some speculated lightning. Others more quietly wondered about something else. When they reached the layer beneath that fused earth, they found pottery of an unfamiliar style, older, more refined, yet made from clay containing minerals absent from the region. A civilization beneath the civilization of Sumer, erased before it could be named. There is a pattern in Mesopotamian art that recurs with unsettling consistency. Gods handing humans a measuring rod and a coil of rope. Archaeologists call it the symbol of construction, but the Sumerians called it the Ziggurats, the heavenly plan. It represented not just architecture, but order itself, the divine template by which both temples and bodies were designed. The gods were not inventors, they were engineers following a code. If one takes the myths at their word, the human body itself was a ziggurat, layers of clay stacked around a core of light. The bones beneath the ziggurat are the opposite of myth. They are proof, but proof that refuses to explain itself. A skull can be measured, but not interpreted without belief. Some say they were priests chosen for symbolic burial, others that they were offerings, their bodies shaped to resemble the gods they served. But when X-rays were later taken of one elongated skull stored in the British Museum, the inner volume was found to be greater than any human's by 30%, and the bone density lower, as if evolved for a different atmospheric pressure. The report was shelved, science moved on, and yet even now local legends around the ruins speak of nights when the ground hums faintly, as if air still circulates through sealed chambers below. Some villagers claim that the ziggurats are not temples at all but markers, caps over deep shafts leading to places the ancients were told never to enter. The old priest said those who dig too deep disturb the sleepers. It sounds like superstition, but history is built on the bones of superstition. Beneath every myth lies an excavation yet unfinished. In 2016, a group of Iraqi archaeologists reopened a trench near Eridu and uncovered a structure buried under 4 meters of flood sediment. Its walls were lined with a glaze of unknown composition, still reflective after thousands of years. Within the central chamber they found fragments of obsidian shaped into lenses, curved and polished. Under magnification, those fragments revealed microscratches consistent with optical use. No Sumerian text mentions lenses, yet here they were, buried beside bones that no one could categorize. When the team attempted to publish their findings, the funding vanished, and the site was quietly resealed. If those bones truly belonged to another lineage, what became of them? Were they wiped out by flood, by design, or by absorption into the species that followed? The myths offer an unsettling answer. The Anunnaki, displeased with their servants' rebellion, decided to mix the races and dilute their divine essence. Perhaps extinction did not come through death, but through inheritance. We may be their shadows, the diluted continuation, carrying fragments of their form and memory, unaware of the deeper strata buried within our genes. Standing atop the ruins of Ur at sunset, the wind moves through the bricks like breath through a throat. The ziggurat hums faintly, each tear radiating warmth long after the sun has fallen. Beneath it, layers of dust, bone, and clay whisper in languages older than words. The ground itself feels alive, as if the earth remembers what it once held. Maybe that is what the Sumerians understood, what their gods had always known. That memory is not kept in writing, but in matter. The bones beneath the ziggurat are not remains, they are archives, encoded in calcium and silence, and if we ever dare to unearth them fully, what truths will rise again into the light? The deeper science digs into the human body, the more it begins to sound like a continuation of the myths it once dismissed. In the quiet hum of laboratories, under the sterile glow of fluorescent light, strands of DNA unwind like miniature scriptures, each coil a line of text written in a code older than language itself. Geneticists call it the blueprint of life, but in Sumerian terms, it would have been called a covenant, the pact sealed in flesh when clay met blood. And perhaps, like the king list, it too records something impossible to explain by time alone. Around 70,000 years ago, the human species passed through what geneticists call a bottleneck, a sudden and severe reduction in population that nearly erased us. Mitochondrial DNA suggests that all living humans share a single maternal ancestor, a woman modern science calls mitochondrial Eve. Similarly, a single male lineage, Y chromosomal Adam, appears tens of thousands of years later. It is as though humanity was rebooted twice, its code rewritten, its diversity narrowed by forces unknown. The causes proposed are natural disasters, volcanic winters, or simple chance. But the Sumerians would have recognized it differently. They would have called it a cleansing, a divine reset, a flood, not of water, but of blood. The Atrahasis tablets describe precisely such an event. The gods, disturbed by human clamor, decide to thin their creation. Pestilence, drought, and famine fail to silence the noise. Finally, the decision is made to erase humanity altogether through deluge. But one man, Atrahasis, is warned by Enki to build a vessel, preserving the seed of life for renewal. The myth, so eerily mirrored in genetic record, suggests not destruction, but reprogramming, an update to the design. Could these population bottlenecks mark deliberate interventions, moments when the genetic code of our species was adjusted, refined, or merged with something new? Ancient DNA reveals other anomalies. Fragments extracted from early Mesopotamian remains show haplogroups that appear nowhere else in the ancient Near East. Their sequences bear slight, inexplicable variations, differences too subtle to form a new species, but distinct enough to stand apart. Similar anomalies appear in the genomes of early Anatolian farmers and mysterious northern populations that predate known migrations. Some researchers quietly note that these genetic ghosts seem to cluster around regions connected by myth: the Caucasus, the Iranian plateau, and Mesopotamia itself. It is as if the cradle of civilization was also a laboratory, an epicenter of experimentation, biological as well as cultural. In the early 2000s, geneticists identified what they called the human-accelerated regions, segments of DNA that change more rapidly in humans than in any other species. One, known as HR1, governs brain development. It differs sharply from the corresponding sequence in chimpanzees, despite millions of years of shared ancestry. The shift occurred suddenly, within a few 100,000 years, an instant in evolutionary time. No intermediate steps, no gradual slope, just an abrupt leap, as if a line of code had been rewritten. To the modern biologist, it is mutation. To the ancient Sumerian, it would have been instruction. The me, those divine decrees the gods bestowed upon humanity, was said to contain the laws of civilization, wisdom, craft, music, and love. But the texts hint at something deeper. Each me was an encoded pattern, an order of being capable of shaping life itself. The gods were keepers of these patterns, distributing them selectively, like permissions in a system of control. The parallels to genetic sequencing are uncanny. The me could be read as metaphors for chromosomes, each tablet an instruction set defining the limits of existence. If so, the myth of Enki stealing the me from heaven may conceal a truth about the transfer of knowledge, or perhaps of code, from one species to another. Modern genomes still carry faint signatures of admixture, traces of other hominins whose names we did not know until recently: Neanderthals, Denisovans, and something else, a mysterious lineage detected in parts of Africa. Neither human nor Neanderthal, its DNA woven into ours like an unfinished sentence. We carry them in our cells, silent companions from a vanished epoch. If the Sumerians remembered beings who walked the earth before us, their stories may not have been allegory but memory, retained in myth because it already lived in their blood. The flood that ends the Atrahasis epic may also conceal a subtler symbolism. In biological terms, a flood can mean a surge of new genetic material sweeping through a population, washing away the old. After each extinction, or near extinction, life begins again, altered. What the Sumerians called divine intervention, science calls selective pressure. Yet both describe the same mechanism: the resetting of the pattern, the pruning of the lineage, the preservation of the chosen seed. Whether by nature or intention, humanity's story is one of repeated culling, renewal, and reconfiguration. In 2010, when geneticists mapped the entire human genome, they were astonished by what they found missing. Over 200 sections appeared to be deleted, not random mutations but clean excisions, as if by design. These absent sequences included fragments linked to cognitive development, immune response, and endocrine regulation. They are gone in all modern humans but present in earlier hominins. It is as though, somewhere between memory and mutation, someone edited us, simplifying the blueprint perhaps to make the species more stable, more obedient, less volatile. The Sumerians would have understood. After the flood, the gods shortened human life, so that man's days be numbered. Less chaos, less noise, a correction, not a curse. The echoes persist, even in the smallest details. Every human being carries fragments of mitochondrial DNA identical to that found in remains over 40,000 years old, a continuity too perfect to be accidental. It's as if a single line of code has been carefully maintained across countless generations, immune to entropy. Some scientists call it the molecular clock, but clocks are tools of measurement, not origins. Who built the first one? Who set it to tick? There is another mystery hidden within our cells: endogenous retroviruses, ancient viral codes embedded into our genome. They make up nearly 8% of what we are. Most are inactive, but some still hum faintly, influencing development and immunity. The Sumerians wrote of Namlu-Ulu, the sickness of the gods, a divine contagion that passed from heaven to earth and altered humankind forever. Perhaps they were describing not plague, but inheritance, the viral delivery of instructions into the clay of creation. Modern science calls it horizontal gene transfer. Myth called it creation. Each strand of DNA carries two kinds of information: the sequence that defines life, and the silence between the sequences, the pauses, the intervals, the regulatory gaps that determine when genes speak and when they sleep. In those spaces lies something no microscope can see: memory, not of individuals but of patterns repeated across epochs. The body remembers what the mind cannot. It is possible that the Sumerians, in their strange myths of blood and clay, were not imagining divine creation at all. They were trying to describe, in the only language they had, a process they once witnessed but no longer understood, a biological intervention that left them both awed and enslaved. Their gods were not metaphors for forces of nature. They were the memory of manipulation itself, encoded into story because no other record would survive. And now, thousands of years later, we uncoil those same strands in laboratories and call it discovery, never realizing that what we find has already been found. The script was written before the species that now reads it existed. The message has always been there, sleeping in our blood. Maybe evolution is not a ladder, but a loop. Maybe the experiment never ended. When the waters of the flood receded, the Sumerian tablets say, kingship descended from heaven once more. It came first to Kish, the first city of the New World. The phrase sounds simple, yet its repetition carries a strange insistence, as though the scribes were trying to remind the future of something extraordinary. Not that rule was inherited, but that it came down, literally, from above. To the Sumerians, heaven was not merely the sky, but a domain that could be approached, navigated, and, if one was chosen, entered. Kish was not simply a city, it was a landing. Archaeologists have traced the ruins of Kish to the plains of modern Tel al-Haima, a place where wind and dust still expose fragments of baked brick stamped with royal seals. But the oldest layers beneath the visible ruins are different. Beneath the flood silt lies a level of blackened soil and fused clay, suggesting both destruction and renewal. In that layer, the remains of early ziggurat foundations point toward a celestial alignment. The cornerstones face the rising of Sirius, the dog star, one of the brightest in the sky, visible at dawn during the summer solstice. No agricultural reason explains this choice. It was astronomical, ritualistic, and deliberate. The earliest kings of Kish bore names that shimmer like riddles: Jushur, Kulasinabel, Nangishlishma, and Taraharna. Their reigns, according to the king list, lasted hundreds of years, shorter than the antediluvian monarchs, but still far beyond human measure. The transition feels abrupt. Before the flood, immortality; after the flood, longevity. It is as if the new kings were not entirely mortal but hybrids, descendants of beings who once ruled without end, now bound by the limits of the earth. Some scholars, noting the phrasing "descended from heaven," have wondered whether these rulers were viewed as literal emissaries, envoys of those who had departed during the deluge. Temples in Kish, unlike those in later cities, contain curious architectural anomalies. The walls of the oldest shrines aligned with mica, a mineral that reflects heat and light but is rare in Mesopotamia. Mica deposits exist thousands of miles away, in regions like Afghanistan and India. Transporting it across deserts would have required a scale of logistics beyond early urban capabilities. Yet there it was, embedded in the temple walls as though to shield or insulate. Modern materials scientists, when shown samples, remarked that the technique resembled early attempts at radiation shielding, a phrase that hangs uncomfortably beside myths of fiery chariots and skyboats descending from the heavens. The Sumerians left no images of angels, no winged seraphim as later religions would. Their sky beings, the Anunnaki, are depicted instead as tall figures wearing what look like elaborate helmets and belts. Some carry objects shaped like small buckets, others hold rods tipped with spheres. Archaeologists call them symbols of purification. Engineers, seeing them centuries later, call them devices. A figure of the eagle-headed god, often shown with wings and wristbands of intricate design, is said to represent Ninurta, the warrior of the skies. But in some carvings, he does not fly by wings alone. He stands within circles surrounded by flames, his feet upon discs that resemble nothing found in nature. In Kish, fragments of these images have been found carved into bricks and cylinder seals. One particularly haunting artifact, housed now in a private collection, shows a procession of men offering baskets to a towering figure emerging from a circular doorway. The doorway is etched with concentric rings. Around it, stars spiral like falling embers. The inscription beneath reads simply, "Those who walk the sky return." Ancient astronomical tablets from later Sumerian cities contain data too precise to have originated from casual observation. They record the orbital periods of Jupiter and Saturn with errors smaller than 1%, and predict eclipses that would occur centuries later. Modern scholars attribute this to careful long-term record-keeping, but that explanation falters when one remembers that such knowledge appears almost immediately after the birth of writing. The priests of Kish, it seems, inherited a science they did not invent. They called their observatories houses of the heavens, and their keepers the eyes of the gods. A few rare inscriptions describe what they saw. One tablet speaks of lights that descend in pairs, moving across the night without sound. Another tells of a wheel of fire that came from the great waters and rested above the city. These are dismissed as celestial metaphors, comets, meteors, the play of imagination. Yet the language they use, precision of number, sequence of movement, feels observational, not poetic. The Sumerians were meticulous record keepers. They distinguished myth from measurement. When they described something, they meant it. There is a story, little known outside the academic margins, that the kings of Kish possessed an object known as the Tablet of Destinies. In myth, this artifact granted control over the fates of men and gods alike, containing within it the laws of heaven's order. Whoever held it could command the elements, direct the winds, and speak with the authority of the stars. It is said that Enlil once seized it from his brother, only to lose it again when it was stolen by a being described as half man, half bird. The story reads like cosmic politics, but perhaps it hides something simpler: the idea that knowledge of the heavens, astronomy, energy, or physics, was once concentrated in an object, a record of the lost science of the skywalkers. In 1950, aerial surveys over southern Iraq revealed faint geometric patterns in the desert, visible only from high altitude, lines radiating from ancient mound sites, forming circles several kilometers wide. Most were dismissed as irrigation remains or caravan routes, yet their symmetry defied random explanation. Some align with solstice points, others mirror constellations. One set, stretching outward from the site of Kish, matches the pattern of Orion's belt, an arrangement that appears in sacred architecture across cultures: in Giza, in Teotihuacan, in Angkor. It is as if an ancient hand drew the same map on every continent, tracing the memory of the same stars. The myth of Etana, the man who ascended to heaven, originates from Kish. The tablets tell how he sought the plant of birth to restore fertility to the land. He prays to Shamash, the sun god, and an eagle appears, offering to carry him aloft. Together they rise higher and higher until the earth becomes like a mountain and the sea like a garden. The description reads eerily like an aerial view. Etana grows fearful. The eagle calms him. When he looks again, the earth has vanished beneath clouds. Then the tablet breaks. The final lines are missing. Some say he reached heaven, others that he fell. Either way, Kish preserved the first recorded dream of flight. If we read the myth literally, the eagle may not be an animal, but a machine. Its feathers symbols of propulsion, its roar mistaken for wind. The Sumerians lacked the language to describe such things. They could only translate them into the vocabulary of nature. The kingship descended from heaven might not mean divine appointment, but physical arrival, the return of beings who once ruled before the flood. And their departure, when the kings of Kish finally gave way to the dynasties of Uruk and Ura, may have been just that, departure. A withdrawal back into the heavens, leaving their knowledge sealed beneath the dust. Today, Kish lies silent, its once sacred geometry eroded by wind. Shepherds lead flocks across the ruins, unaware that each step presses upon layers of forgotten architecture. But when night comes and the sky unfolds its map of ancient fire, the stars still hang in the same positions the priests once charted. Their pattern has not changed. The kings may have vanished, but their constellations remain, markers of an inheritance too vast to claim. Maybe the gods did not die, nor depart. Maybe they merely changed altitude. In 1849, a British archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard brushed the dust from a shattered palace wall in what is now northern Iraq. Beneath the heat and indifference of centuries, he uncovered something that the world had forgotten. Rows upon rows of clay tablets, piled like bricks, each marked with cuneiform signs so dense that the script seemed to breathe. It was the royal library of Ashurbanipal, last great king of Assyria, ruler of Nineveh. The tablets numbered in the tens of thousands: myths, incantations, astronomical tables, medical treatises, and histories stretching back to Sumer itself. The king, who called himself he who knows the secret of the written tablets, had gathered the wisdom of every temple and archive he could find. He claimed that the words he preserved were not his own, but the inheritance of gods who wrote before the flood. At first, scholars were ecstatic. The lost world of Mesopotamia had begun to speak again. But as translators progressed, the enthusiasm turned to unease. Among the lists and hymns lay fragments of texts that did not fit any known cosmology. Some spoke of races that predated humanity, others of celestial wars and beings who descended to earth to establish order. A few contained what could only be described as instructions, descriptions of measurements, alignments, and devices whose purposes were lost. These were quietly removed from the main catalog, labeled ritual fragments or unidentified tablets. Their translations were never published in full. George Smith, the young Assyriologist who first deciphered the story of the Great Flood in 1872, was said to have leapt from his chair in the reading room of the British Museum when he realized its similarity to the Genesis account. But there were other tablets he never spoke of. In letters found after his death, he wrote of certain fragments that contained doctrines of such strange and impious character that they must be withheld. He described one tablet that mentioned the making of men in 7 vessels of clay, and another that told of the mixing of the essences of heaven with the blood of beasts. He never published these notes, and soon after his expedition to Nineveh ended abruptly, the official narrative of the library's discovery remains one of triumph. Yet beneath that story lies another, a quieter, more unsettling truth. Many of the tablets Laird shipped to London were never displayed. Some were catalogued and stored, their inscriptions deemed too fragmentary to matter. Others were lost in transit, their crates disappearing into the bureaucratic void between excavation and empire. The ones that arrived intact were selectively translated, often edited to align with biblical expectations. Victorian England, still steeped in theology, could not accommodate the possibility that civilization might predate the creation of man. A few rare scholars, eccentric, often marginalized, argued that the forbidden tablets contained echoes of an earlier science. They pointed to passages describing the chariot of the sun, whose wheel turned not upon earth, and the stones that speak fire when struck by light. Such lines, dismissed as metaphor, carry an uncanny resonance when read beside modern technology. The tablets spoke, too, of beings who came from the upper sea and taught the lore of numbers. The phrase upper sea puzzled translators. Some took it to mean the heavens, others a celestial ocean. But to the Sumerians, the word Abzu referred to the abyss below, and Anzu to the expanse above, the mirror of the deep. The upper sea might not be the sky as we know it, but something beyond it. Ashurbanipal himself claimed to have read texts from before the time of the flood, written in a language so old that only the gods could understand it. He boasted of his ability to consult the writing of antediluvian days. If his claim was mere vanity, it was an unusual kind. Kings glorify conquest, not philology. His obsession with the past feels less like scholarship than preservation, an attempt to keep alive a memory that the world was trying to erase. In 1873, when the first crates of tablets reached London, a team of translators under the British Museum began sorting them by category. A small subset was marked with a simple symbol, a diagonal cross in red ink. Those pieces, according to later accounts, contained cosmological material unsuitable for public release. The reasons were never specified. Some have since speculated that they dealt with doctrines of cyclical destruction, or of beings who shaped humanity directly. A few fragments surfaced in private collections decades later, describing the shining ones who measured the deep, and the watchers who bound the wind. Their authenticity remains debated, but the tone matches the known cuneiform corpus. In Nineveh itself, the palace walls bore carvings of winged figures tending to trees that glowed with circular fruits. Between them stood a robed deity holding what appears to be a pine cone and a device resembling a wristwatch. Archaeologists interpreted the scene as a ritual of fertilization, yet the repetition of these motifs, wristbands, bags, tree, cone, across every culture from Assyria to the Maya, suggests something more than coincidence. It is as though the same story was being retold in the language of symbols, the transmission of life, knowledge, and control from beings who once walked among men. One of the most disturbing discoveries in the Library of Nineveh was a text later titled the Book of the Giants. It tells of beings created by the mingling of divine and human essences, giants who became violent, who devoured the flesh of the earth. The gods, angered by their rebellion, sent a flood to cleanse the world. Versions of this tale appear in the apocryphal Book of Enoch and in fragments from Qumran, yet the Sumerian version predates them by millennia. In both, the flood is less punishment than reset, a sterilization event to remove the hybrid strain. When the British Museum eventually published its official selections from the Nineveh Library, these darker fragments were conspicuously absent. Only the myths of creation, kingship, and the flood were printed, stripped of their more troubling implications. The rest were relegated to unclassified, left untranslated in basement archives where temperature and bureaucracy preserve them equally well. A few curators in moments of candor admit that certain boxes remain unopened to this day, labeled simply miscellaneous. The secrecy is not entirely surprising. Empires, ancient or modern, understand the danger of origins. To question the foundation is to loosen the structure above it. If the Sumerian record were read in full, it might suggest that humanity is not the author of its own story, but a continuation of someone else's. That idea, even now, remains forbidden. In 2003, during the chaos that followed the invasion of Iraq, the Baghdad Museum was looted. Among the countless artifacts stolen were hundreds of cuneiform tablets recovered from Nineveh and other sites. Some resurfaced years later on the black market. Others disappeared entirely. A handful appeared briefly in photographs, small curved pieces of clay with unusual inscriptions, lines of symbols not in standard Sumerian. Experts called them forgeries. Yet the pattern of the characters looked strangely consistent, as if copied from a source no longer available. Perhaps those were the missing fragments, the ones that once bore the red cross. There is an old saying among archivists: every collection has its ghost. The Library of Nineveh has thousands. Each tablet is a heartbeat of a civilization that tried to remember. Each fragment, a whisper of something too vast for empire or religion to contain. The flood may have washed away the cities, but the clay endured. What has not endured is permission to read it freely, somewhere. Deep in the vaults of museums or the private safes of collectors, the forbidden tablets still wait. Those pieces that spoke of the beings before the flood, of the designs that shaped flesh, of the knowledge that once ruled the heavens. Perhaps one day they will surface again, or perhaps they already have, hidden under a different name, studied in laboratories that no longer call their subjects gods. Until then, they remain what they have always been, the unread pages of our own origin. And maybe the silence around them is not neglect, but protection. From truths that even clay was not meant to preserve. Every civilization has its memory of water. The Greeks told of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who repopulated the world with stones that became men. The Hebrews told of Noah and the ark. The Mesopotamians told of Atrahasis, who was warned by Enki before the great deluge. And deep beneath these overlapping myths lies a quiet consensus that refuses to die. That once, long before recorded history, something washed the earth clean. The Sumerians called it the day the storm swallowed the land. Modern geologists call it meltwater pulse 1b. The names differ, but the silence that followed is the same. Around 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, the planet warmed with startling speed. Glaciers that had towered for millennia melted in centuries. The sea rose violently, drowning coastlines that had nurtured life since before language. Entire land bridges vanished. The connection between Britain and Europe, between Asia and the Americas, the shelf where the Persian Gulf now lies. If the Sumerians were the inheritors of an older memory, perhaps this was its origin. A flood not of myth, but of geology. Yet the tablets insist it was more than natural disaster. They describe intention. The gods met in council and decided to destroy humankind because it had grown noisy. The word noisy in Sumerian rigmu does not simply mean loud. It implies disturbance, vibration, interference. Perhaps what disturbed the gods was not sound, but signal. The Atrahasis epic describes the sequence with unnerving precision. Drought first, then plague, then famine, then finally the release of the waters of heaven. Each phase feels deliberate, like a test of resilience. And when humanity still survived, the final switch was thrown. The flood that followed was total. It erased the calendar itself. The years of the kings before the flood were counted in thousands, those after in hundreds. Longevity shortened, memory dimmed, and language fractured. In myth, it was punishment. In another reading, it was recalibration. Archaeological evidence shows that the oldest cities of Sumer, Eridu, or Shurupak, are built atop deep layers of clay silt. Beneath those layers lie older settlements, erased by water. When Woolley excavated Ur, he found 6 meters of sterile flood deposit between 2 cultural strata, thick enough to separate epochs. To him, it proved the historicity of the biblical flood. But later surveys complicated the story. Each city's flood layer differed in depth and timing. The deluge was not global, but regional. Still, the coincidence remained uncanny. A wave of destruction sweeping the cradle of civilization, erasing one world and inaugurating another. Yet what if the physical flood was only part of the event? Every culture describes the same pattern, not just drowning, but forgetting. Knowledge lost, tools abandoned, calendars reset. Civilization does not simply fall, it reboots. In the Sumerian Eridu Genesis, after the flood, the gods grant humanity shorter days, quicker hearts. The phrase could mean shorter lives, or faster thought, compressed generations, acceleration, evolution by catastrophe. Some researchers have proposed that the flood marks not only a climatic break but a genetic one. Around this same period, DNA records show a mysterious reduction in genetic diversity, a bottleneck in which most human lineages disappeared. It coincides with the Younger Dryas cold event when a comet or massive outburst of meltwater may have plunged the world into chaos. But the myths never speak of ice or asteroids. They speak of decision. The gods gathered, debated, and acted. Enlil wanted silence. Enki wanted survival. Between them, the world was remade. The word flood in Sumerian Abubu also means destruction by water, but shares a root with Abzu, the abyss, the underworld sea from which life first rose. In that double meaning lies a strange symmetry. The same element that creates also erases. The Sumerians did not view floods as accidents, but as cycles of cleansing, the heartbeat of creation itself. To destroy was to make room for renewal. The flood was not the end, it was the reset button of the cosmos. When the flood ended, the texts say, "The gods smell the sweet savor of sacrifice." That phrase, repeated later in Genesis, may conceal more than ritual imagery. In chemical terms, the scent of burning flesh or grain is the scent of transformation, organic matter returning to air. To the gods, it was not worship but data, proof that the new species had survived the trial. Humanity had passed through fire and water, reduced to essentials. The surviving code was simpler, more obedient. The survivors of the Sumerian flood were few. Atrahasis, his family, and the seed of every living thing drifted on the waters until they found land at the mountain of Nisia. When the gods gathered again, Enki persuaded them to restrain future destruction. From then on, the balance would be maintained by mortality, disease, and limitation. The flood would not need to return, its principles were written into flesh. Humanity would carry the reset within itself. Somewhere beneath the Persian Gulf, geologists believe, lies the cradle of that forgotten world. The once fertile basin now drowned beneath 50 meters of water. In the sediment cores pulled from the Gulf floor, scientists have found pollen from date palms and reeds, traces of rivers long vanished. During the Ice Age, this region was a vast plain, fed by the Tigris, Euphrates, and Karen, and Eden before Eden. When the sea returned, it swallowed the land and drove its people north, where they built the first cities of Sumer. The flood, then, was not just memory, it was migration. The survivors carried their story with them, rewriting it in myth so it would not die. And yet the flood stories share another detail often ignored. Before the deluge, humanity was warned. The gods did not act in secret. They whispered to a chosen few. Enki spoke through walls, through reeds, through dreams. Utnapishtim in Gilgamesh hears his warning from the voice of the temple, a phrase that could mean an oracle or a device. The builders of the ark were not prophets but engineers, given dimensions, materials, and instructions precise enough to float a vessel through apocalypse. The ark, in this light, was not a miracle, but a machine. When the waters receded, the survivors emerged into silence. Their gods had vanished, their cities erased. They became the new beginning. In time, their children built shrines to the ones who had saved them, not realizing that those same beings had also destroyed the world before. Civilization, as it rose again, was a form of remembering. Each brick laid in Ur or Kish was an act of defiance against forgetting, a reconstruction of what had been lost. Modern science sees the flood as geology, religion sees it as morality. But to the Sumerians, it was neither. It was calibration, a cosmic pulse to restore balance between chaos and order, between noise and silence. The flood came not to punish, but to maintain the rhythm of the world. Like the rising and falling of breath, destruction was only the exhalation of creation. Sometimes, late at night, when rain lashes the ground and rivers rise beyond their banks, you can almost feel a memory awaken. The same water that once erased worlds still runs through our veins. Every drop has been here before, circling endlessly through time. The flood was not an event, it was a reminder. And perhaps, when the balance tips again, it will come once more, not from heaven, but from our own hands. Long after the flood waters withdrew and the plains of Sumer dried to dust, something curious happened. Humanity began to rebuild, but not with the wild inventiveness of survivors grasping for life. Instead, they built as if they remembered, methodically, geometrically, following patterns too precise for improvisation. The temples rose not like experiments but like recollections. The blueprints had survived, even if their makers had not. And those who carried them, the priestly architects of the New Age, didn't speak freely of what they knew. They spoke through ritual, through symbol, through silence. The Sumerians called them the Ensi, the high priests and governors who acted as mediators between gods and men. The Lugal, the king, was their counterpart, the arm that enforced what the temple mind conceived. In this hierarchy, power was not inherited but distributed. The divine law flowed downward through layers of secrecy, encoded in rites and texts only a few could read. Writing itself, though revolutionary, was never meant for the masses. It began as a sacred technology confined to temples, controlled by scribes sworn to discretion. The clay tablets that we now treat as relics of civilization were, in their time, instruments of containment. They kept knowledge from spreading too quickly, ensuring that only those sanctioned could shape reality with words. Archaeologists often celebrate the invention of writing as humanity's great awakening. But one could also read it as the moment when memory was centralized, when knowledge stopped belonging to everyone who could speak and began belonging to those who could record. Oral cultures share, written cultures guard. The first archives were not libraries, but fortresses. The first scribes were not poets, but gatekeepers. In the temple of Iana at Uruk, the earliest known administrative tablets record not prayers or myths, but grain rations and label lists. Each entry is a fragment of control, proof that order had become sacred. The gods no longer needed to descend from the sky to govern humanity. The Ensi did it in their stead, armed with symbols and seals. Their power lay in their ability to define reality through writing. To name a thing was to possess it. The divine voice had been replaced by bureaucracy. Yet beneath this new order lingered a trace of something older, the memory of those who had once ruled without words. The myths describe the me, the divine decrees that governed everything from justice to weaving, from kingship to love. Each me was said to be a cosmic formula stored in the temple of Enki. When Inanna, goddess of Uruk, stole them, she brought civilization to her city. But her theft had consequences. The gods, angered, demanded balance. Knowledge was never meant to be free. One can almost hear the echo of that prohibition in every age that follows. Every empire that rises invents its own priesthood of silence, custodians who decide what truths the people may touch. In ancient Sumeria, it was the temple scribes. In later ages, it would be scholars, theologians, scientists. The faces change, but the hierarchy remains. The clay tablets became scrolls, the scrolls became books, the books became data, but always the keeper stood between the world and its understanding. Some archaeologists believe that the earliest ziggurats were designed not only as temples, but as instruments of communication. Their terraces align with stars, their staircases echo the geometry of sound waves, the chambers resonate at specific frequencies. When the wind passes through the corridors, it produces tones that vibrate in harmonic intervals, minor thirds, perfect fifths, like the tuning of an unseen lyre. It is as though the builder sought to recreate the voice of heaven through architecture. But if those vibrations once carried messages, they are silent now. The instruments have fallen out of tune. A few rare inscriptions suggest that the Ensi maintained something more than ritual. They kept what the texts call Nam Shub, the binding words. These were formulas of sound and rhythm capable of shaping perception itself. To recite them correctly was to open a channel between worlds, to mispronounce them was to invite disaster. Only those initiated through years of training could hear the tones without madness. Whether this refers to esoteric meditation or to remnants of a lost acoustic science, no one can say. Yet the parallel with modern concepts of resonance and frequency is haunting. Perhaps the architects of silence understood that knowledge was not only power, but vibration, that truth must be tuned to remain stable. After the flood, the gods were said to withdraw from direct contact, delegating their will to intermediaries. In myth, this withdrawal is described as exile. In history, it appears as organization. The temples became the nervous system of the new civilization, each city-state a neuron transmitting edicts through networks of scribes and priests. The more complex the system became, the quieter it grew. Direct revelation gave way to protocol, mystery became administration, the living gods were replaced by their symbols, and the symbols by clay. It is tempting to see this as progress, a shift from myth to reason, but perhaps it was loss. The earliest hymns of Sumer praised the voice of the gods as thunder, music, command. Later texts praise the written word instead. The transition from sound to script marks a fall from immediacy to distance, from communion to interpretation. Writing preserved the divine message, but only by embalming it. The priests who once heard the gods began instead to read them. Somewhere in that transition, the original purpose of knowledge was forgotten. The Ensi believed they were protecting humanity from chaos by filtering divine truth, but they may also have been ensuring their own dominion. To control what could be spoken was to control what could be imagined. The architects of silence understood that forgetting can be as powerful as remembering. In the ruins of ancient Nippur, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of broken tablets. Among them were duplicates of known texts, but with small variations, missing lines, altered names, deliberate omissions. It seems that scribes maintain multiple versions of the same myths, adjusted for political convenience. History from its beginning was already being edited. The silence was not ignorance, it was design. Today, museums display these fragments as if they were windows into the dawn of civilization. But they are also mirrors. The same impulse to archive, to classify, to curate knowledge behind glass continues in every digital server and restricted database. We inherit not just the wisdom of Sumer, but its secrecy. We too are the descendants of those who built temples to preserve power through silence. When you stand before a cuneiform tablet, the air between you and it feels heavy, as if time itself has been pressurized into that slab of clay. Each mark, each wedge, each pause between signs is a breath withheld. The priests of Sumer are long gone, but their architecture endures, not in stone, but in the structure of how humanity remembers. Maybe the gods never demanded worship at all. Maybe they only demanded control of the story, and perhaps the greatest silence of all is the one that remains whenever we mistake preservation for truth. Long before empires crowned their rulers with gold, the kings of Sumer wore divinity in their veins. Their right to rule was not written in law but in blood, a lineage said to reach back to the gods themselves. On clay tablets, in the oldest records of kingship, the names stretch across centuries. They are neither entirely human nor entirely myth. A Sumerian king list treats them as historical, yet their reigns defy human measure. Alulim of Eridu, 28,000 years. Al-Algar of Bad Tabira, 36,000. Numbers are absurd yet persistent, as if the scribes were trying to quantify something more than time. Perhaps they were measuring purity, the concentration of a divine inheritance that faded generation by generation. After the flood, that inheritance thinned. The gods no longer walked openly among men. The kings still called themselves their descendants, but their lifespans shrank, their temples multiplied, and their authority required constant reinforcement through ritual. The divine blood had diluted, and with it the certainty of power. The tablets speak of dynasties founded by those born of the Shining Ones, beings described as radiant, tall, and unaging. Their offspring, half mortal, carried traces of the light but could no longer sustain it. A flood had not erased the divine, it had buried it in flesh. In early Sumerian art, kings are shown standing between two worlds. Their posture is not one of humility, but of mediation. One hand raised toward the heavens, the other gripping the rod and ring, the insignia of measure and law. These were not merely symbols of authority. The rod represented the divine standard, the length by which creation was ordered. The ring, the eternal cycle binding heaven and earth. Together they proclaimed the king's role as the calibrator of reality. He was not chosen by the people. He was an instrument of the cosmic order. His bloodline, therefore, had to remain pure, not in the sense of race, but of resonance. Only those whose essence still vibrated with the divine frequency could carry the burden of kingship. In the temple hymns of Nippur, the gods are described as those who seed the kings. The phrase suggests more than poetic metaphor. It implies transmission, a genetic bequeathal. Many ancient cultures echoed this idea. The Egyptian pharaohs were sons of Ra, the Chinese emperors the sons of heaven. In the Indus Valley, inscriptions mention rulers as bearers of the spark. Across continents, the pattern repeats. Kingship framed as inheritance from beings not entirely human. The consistency hints not at coincidence, but at memory, a shared recollection of origin. Modern scholars, wary of divinity, have reinterpreted this as political theology, myths crafted to legitimize authority. Yet even in that reading, something remains unexplained. Why would early humanity, struggling to survive, invent such a complex cosmology of bloodlines? Why speak of transmission through seed and essence if not to preserve a truth that once seemed self-evident? The Sumerians were not naive. They understood hierarchy, mortality, decay. Their obsession with genealogies was not superstition, it was strategy. To preserve divine heritage was to maintain stability, to ensure that the resonance between heaven and earth did not collapse entirely. The oldest dynastic inscriptions reveal subtle divisions between the royal lines. The kings of Kish claimed descent from the gods of the sky, those of Uruk from the gods of wisdom and water. Ur's kings traced their lineage to the moon, god Nana. Each city guarded its divine ancestry as jealously as territory. Intermarriage between dynasties was rare, but when it occurred, it was celebrated as cosmic reconciliation, a merging of celestial bloodlines. The sacred marriage ritual, in which the king united with the high priestess embodying Inanna, symbolized this fusion of mortal and divine. The rite was more than theater. It was biological politics, a reenactment of the ancient covenant that had once bound gods and men. The belief in divine blood did not fade with time, it evolved. As empires rose and fell, the concept migrated, disguised beneath new languages. The Akkadian rulers called themselves Sharu Kibrat Arbaim, kings of the four quarters of the world, inheritors of the Sumerian mandate. The Assyrians spoke of the seed of Asher. The Persians traced their line to the stars. The Romans, inheriting the mantle of empire, made their emperors gods upon death, pretending to restore what the flood had taken. Even in medieval Europe, monarchs ruled by divine right, the coronations echoing Sumerian rites older than recorded time. The myth had simply changed its clothes. There is a haunting pattern in human history. The farther the divine recedes, the more desperately men try to recreate it. The genetic purity once guarded through lineage becomes ideology. The resonance of blood becomes doctrine. The Sumerians had priests to measure it. Later empires had genealogists. In modern times, science has replaced the temple and DNA the altar. Yet the same instinct persists, the longing to trace ourselves back to something greater than chance. Every ancestry test, every search for origin, is an echo of that ancient desire to know who the gods were and what they left behind in us. Some researchers have noticed peculiar anomalies in the royal mummies of Ur. The bone structures are slightly different, the cranial volumes marginally larger. The mitochondrial DNA extracted from the remains of Queen Puarbi, a noblewoman buried with gold and lapis ornaments, contains rare haplogroups found nowhere else in the region. These results are inconclusive, but suggestive. Puarbi's tomb was discovered sealed, untouched since burial, as though guarding a genetic time capsule. When the results were published, the samples were quietly withdrawn for further verification. They were never released again. Ancient texts hint that the kings understood their own decline. The lamentation for Ur mourns not only the city's fall, but the departure of its gods. Their seed has flown to the heavens, their light extinguished on earth. The priests wept because they knew what it meant. The last carriers of the divine pattern were dying. Humanity would continue, but dimmer, slower, more forgetful. The god's blood, once a torrent, had become a trickle, and yet traces remain. In nearly every ancient civilization, myth speaks of heroes of mixed birth, half mortal, half divine, who emerged during crises to restore balance. Gilgamesh, Achilles, Hercules, all belong to that fading generation. They are the last ripples of our biological memory, the echo of a design that once walked in daylight. The Sumerians might have seen them not as miracles but as vestiges, the final resonance of a frequency the world could no longer sustain. If the gods did leave, perhaps they did not vanish but withdrew their essence, sealing it within a species that could evolve on its own. The kings, then, were not chosen but preserved, living repositories of a code too dangerous to lose. Over time, even they forgot. And the blood became metaphor, the rituals became politics, and the archives turned to myth. But every so often the myth stirs. We dig up the bones, measure their proportions, analyze their genomes, and wonder why the data feels familiar. The kings of Sumer built their ziggurats not merely as temples but as monuments to memory. Each tier, each brick, each stairway was a plea to the heavens. Remember us. Remember that we once carried your light. Their prayers, baked into clay, outlasted their bones. And though the lineages have scattered into the dust of history, the question they asked still hangs in the air, heavy and unresolved. If our blood truly began in heaven, what happens when heaven forgets? In the heart of Sumer's oldest myths, two brothers divide the world. One governs heaven's authority, the other governs its secrets. Enlil, stern and lawful, rules from the winds and storms, his will the measure of divine order. Enki, his younger counterpart, dwells in the deep, lord of water, wisdom and rebellion. Between them unfolds a tension older than scripture itself, the struggle between control and curiosity, silence and knowledge. It is in this mythic rivalry that humanity first becomes conscious, and consciousness, for the Sumerians, was not a gift, it was an accident. The Enki and Ninmah tablets describe the moment of creation not as miracle, but as problem-solving. The gods, weary of labor, beg for relief. Enki devises a plan. Mix the clay of the Abzu with divine essence, mold it into beings capable of toil and thought. The goddess Ninmah shapes the forms. Enki breathes life into them. But when the creatures begin to think for themselves, when their speech multiplies and their curiosity awakens, Enlil grows angry. The world was not meant for sentient servants. The rebellion of thought had begun. What follows is a mythic echo of censorship. Enlil decrees silence, commands floods, sends drought and plague to mute the noise of the new race. Yet Enki intervenes again, whispering warnings, teaching survival. He does not openly defy heaven. He subverts it. In one tale, he speaks through a reed wall to Atrahasis, revealing the coming deluge. In another, he disguises his messages in song and dream. The god of wisdom wears a mask of trickery. To teach truth, he must first hide it. Archaeologists studying the hymns of Eridu, the city dedicated to Enki, note that the earliest depictions of his temple, the Iabsu, differ from others. It was not a tower like the Ziggurats of Enlil's cult, but a labyrinth of chambers leading downward into the ground. The inscriptions call it the house that rises from the waters. Its rituals were said to involve descent, immersion, and re-emergence, a symbolic death and rebirth. Some scholars believe these ceremonies were initiations into secret knowledge. Others suspect something stranger, that the temple itself was designed as a physical interface with the subterranean Abzu, the underworld sea that symbolized both creation and data. The divine archive of all things. Enki's followers spoke of the me, the divine formulas that governed existence. Unlike Enlil's commandments, which dictated behavior, Enki's me defined reality itself. Each was a pattern, a vibration, a law of nature encoded in word and number. To possess them was to reshape the world. The myths tell how Inanna stole these me from Enki's temple and carried them to Uruk, bringing civilization to humankind. In that act, disobedience became Genesis. The theft of knowledge birthed culture. The story echoes across time. In Greek myth, Prometheus steals fire from Olympus. In the Hebrew tradition, Eve eats from the tree of knowledge. But the Sumerian version is older, quieter, more ambiguous. Enki is no simple benefactor. His wisdom is double-edged, his motives unreadable. He creates mankind to then curses them. He teaches them writing, then hides its full meaning. He saves humanity from the flood, but also ensures their dependence on the gods. To the Sumerians, wisdom was never free. It was a form of power that demanded obedience, even as it liberated. Some historians interpret Enki as a personification of the deep mind, the unconscious reservoir of innovation and chaos that opposes the rigid intellect symbolized by Enlil. But there are moments in the text that feel too technical for metaphor. The breath of life Enki gives is described as a nintu, literally that which causes motion. The word suggests mechanism as much as miracle. When he molds humans from clay and blood, the process reads almost like engineering. He measured, he shaped, he joined their parts, he gave them the heart of the gods and the voice of the earth. The Sumerian verb for join here implies assembly, not birth. To read these lines aloud is to feel their precision, their coldness. Creation, in Enki's hands, is procedure. There is another darker side to his myth. In the Enki and Inanna cycle, he creates beings called Galu, intermediaries between worlds, half spirit, half machine. Their task is to enforce boundaries, to ensure that certain knowledge remains hidden. They guard the gates between realms and silence those who cross without permission. The Sumerians depicted them as faceless figures, wearing masks of hammered metal, eyes wide and blank. The Galu was said to dwell beneath the earth, emerging only when summoned by priests of Eridu. To encounter one was to risk madness. Over centuries, Enki's image changed. In Babylon, he became Ea, the kind counselor of humanity. The edges were softened, the trickster buried beneath reverence. But the older texts never forget his duplicity. In one hymn he boasts, "I deceive to preserve, I destroy to renew." Roy. His wisdom is not benevolence, it is entropy managed by design. The world's cycles of flood and rebirth, ignorance and enlightenment are his doing. Every reset, every silence, every rediscovery follows his pattern. Enki is the architect of both progress and amnesia. Modern scholars who compare myth with cognitive history sometimes suggest that Enki represents the earliest understanding of self-awareness, the moment when humans realized they could question the gods, and therefore became them. But the myths seem to suggest something more literal. Enki's temple rituals describe the awakening of clay through a process of vibration and sound. Priests chanted at specific frequencies, their voices amplified by the temple's water channels. The effect would have been hypnotic, disorienting. Some believe these chants induced altered states, allowing initiates to hear the speech of the gods. The others speculate that the acoustics themselves were part of an ancient technology, a means to manipulate perception, to encode information through resonance. In later millennia, this idea of hidden wisdom passed to every tradition that followed. The Hermetic alchemists of Alexandria called it the secret fire. The Gnostics called it the spark. The Kabbalists the voice of the Shekinah. Yet each is an echo of Enki's paradox, illumination disguised as deception. Humanity keeps rediscovering the same truth and forgetting it again, as if memory itself was cyclical. Perhaps that too is part of his design. For in the Sumerian worldview, no act of rebellion escapes the divine order. Even disobedience fulfills a role. When Enki defies Enlil to save humanity, he is not overthrowing authority. He is maintaining the balance that allows authority to exist. His chaos is the counterpoint that preserves structure. Without him, creation would stagnate. With him, it never rests. The mask he wears is both mercy and control. It is tempting to wonder whether the figure of Enki represents not a single god, but a lineage, a role passed down through priesthoods, secret societies, or perhaps beings who once walked the earth disguised among men. The title, Lord of the Abzu, could easily belong to any keeper of subterranean archives, any guardian of the world's buried knowledge. His symbol, the two serpents entwined around a staff, survives in medicine even today, a quiet emblem of healing and manipulation intertwined. The myths end with Enki's laughter, a strange, weary laughter that follows every catastrophe. He knows that humanity will build, destroy, and build again. He knows that the cycle cannot be broken because it was designed to repeat. When the flood came, he preserved a remnant. When the temples rose, he withdrew. And perhaps even now his mask remains, in institutions, in doctrines, in the systems that both enlighten and control? Maybe Enki never left the Abzu at all. Maybe we're still living inside the echo of his design, thinking our thoughts and calling them our own, never realizing they were planted there long ago by a god who smiled behind water's veil. Long before the deltas of the Tigris and Euphrates met the sea, the coastline of Mesopotamia extended far into what is now the Persian Gulf. 10,000 years ago, that gulf was not an oceanic basin but a vast plain, fertile, green, webbed with rivers that met in quiet lagoons. Archaeologists call it the Gulf Oasis, a lost landscape drowned as sea levels rose after the Ice Age. But the Sumerians did not describe it as lost land. They called it Dilmun, the place where the sun rises, the pure and bright land, the dwelling of the gods before the flood. In their tablets, it is a paradise of spring water and immortality, untouched by disease or death. They wrote that the rivers of the world flowed from there. To them, Dilmun was not myth, it was origin. In the mid-20th century, oceanographers began mapping the floor of the Persian Gulf. What they found matched the contours of the ancient Sumerian description, a network of submerged riverbeds, deltas, and what appeared to be the foundations of settlements, now lying beneath 50 meters of water. Core samples revealed pollen from palm and date trees, vegetation consistent with a once thriving oasis. The timing of its submersion aligned eerily with the period of the flood recorded in the Eridu Genesis. For centuries, Dilmun was thought to be symbolic, a metaphor for purity. Now it seems more likely that it was memory. If the gods once dwelled in Dilmun, then perhaps the first temples of Sumer were built as memorials to that drowned homeland. Eridu, the oldest known city in Mesopotamia, sits at the edge of what was once the Gulf's shore. Its earliest layers date to nearly 7,000 years ago, older than the pyramids, older than writing itself. Beneath its later ziggurat, excavators found foundations of 21 successive temples, each built directly atop the last, as if the inhabitants were trying to preserve a precise location rather than expand it. The deepest level was not a temple at all, but a platform of mud brick facing east toward the vanished sea. The inscriptions call it the House of the Waters. To the Sumerians, Eridu was sacred not because it was first, but because it was remembered. They believed it was founded by Enki himself, who emerged from the Abzu, the subterranean sea that mirrored the drowned plain of Dilmun. In their cosmology, the underworld was not a place of punishment but of memory, a vault of origins. Every temple that rose above the earth had its reflection below, an unseen twin that preserved its essence. When the upper structure fell, the lower remained, intact beneath silt and time. If one reads the myth of the flood alongside this architecture, a strange symmetry appears. What the waters erased, the earth archived. Divers exploring the northern Gulf in recent decades have reported curious anomalies, rectilinear formations of stone blocks, buried walls, and even what appear to be steps descending into sound. Officially, these are dismissed as natural sediment formations, yet photographs show patterns too regular, too deliberate. The Gulf's visibility is poor, its currents unpredictable, and excavations rare. But every so often, fishermen drag up fragments, pottery shards with incised designs older than any known Sumerian style, beads of carnelian and lapis lazuli polished beyond Neolithic skill. They wash ashore, unclaimed, as if the sea itself still returns its secrets piece by piece. In 2011, a joint research team from the University of Birmingham proposed that the entire cradle of Sumerian civilization might have originated from displaced communities of the Gulf Oasis, forced inland by rising waters around 8000 BCE. Their theory, controversial and quietly ignored, suggested that the earliest myths of Eridu and the gods' descent from heaven may record not celestial events, but migration from the drowned south. Heaven, in this interpretation, was the sea. The descent of kingship from heaven may have meant simply the arrival of survivors from the depths. But other evidence deepens the mystery. Geological surveys have identified vitrified sand, grains fused by intense heat, beneath certain sediment layers on the Gulf floor. The temperature required to create such fusion exceeds anything produced by lightning or volcanic activity in the region. Some suggest meteor impacts. Others, more quietly, wonder whether the catastrophe that ended Dilmun was not entirely natural. The Sumerian texts describe the flood not as rainfall, but as fire and water mingling in the heavens, a storm that glowed with light. To them, it was divine retribution. To modernize, it sounds like plasma. The myth of Dilmun also carries an undercurrent of longing. After the flood, Enki sends the goddess Ninsikil to restore fertility to the land. She purifies the waters, commands the rivers to flow again, and life returns. But the text ends with a lament. The place where the sun rises is hidden beneath the waves. The Sumerians knew that paradise had sunk. They built their cities inland, but always near water, as if hoping the sea might one day retreat and reveal what was lost. The Abzu, the underground sea of myth, may be an echo of that memory, a symbolic reconstruction of the drowned homeland. Enki's temple at Eridu was said to connect directly to it through sacred wells. Priests drew water not from rivers but from these hidden reservoirs, believing they accessed the same primordial source. The act of drawing water was more than sustenance. It was communication, a ritual of remembrance. Every drop carried the voice of the deep. When they poured libations, they were not offering to gods above, but to the ancestors below. What remains astonishing is how consistent this imagery is across ancient cultures. The Egyptians spoke of Zep Tepi, the first time when the gods ruled from a land swallowed by the sea. The Hindus remembered Dwarka, Krishna's golden city lost to the ocean. The Greeks told of Atlantis, the bright island that fell in a single night. Each story points to a memory submerged, a civilization that vanished when the seas rose. The Sumerians, however, never called it lost. They called it home. In the quiet mud of the Gulf floor, sonar scans reveal patterns that suggest roadways or canals, traces of irrigation far older than known agriculture. If confirmed, they would force history backward by thousands of years, challenging the idea that civilization began in Sumer. Instead, Sumer would be its refugee, its child born from exile. But such findings remain buried in academic silence. Funding for underwater archaeology in the region is scarce. Political instability discourages exploration. Perhaps, as always, forgetting is safer. The myths that persist. They whisper of a time when the gods walked upon the earth, when rivers were young and death unknown. They whisper of a doorway beneath the waves where the world can be reborn. And sometimes, in moments of uncanny coincidence, the water seems to remember. In 2018, during a period of unusual drought, parts of the Shat al-Arhab riverbed receded to reveal stone foundations aligned with ancient star maps. Locals who saw them said it looked as if the ground itself was breathing. Within weeks, the tides returned, and the stones disappeared again. Perhaps they were never meant to stay uncovered. The gods of Sumer hid their origins well, sinking them beneath the same element that once gave life to clay. The sea, like memory, protects through erasure. What lies beneath the rivers is not ruin, but record, a world waiting to be read when humanity is ready to face the cost of remembering. Until then, the waves murmur their refrain, patient and unchanging. What is drowned is not dead, only waiting for breath. When the sands of Mesopotamia began to yield their buried libraries to the modern world, the rediscovery of Sumer should have rewritten everything. Here were texts older than Moses, kings older than Egypt, myths older than Genesis. Yet what we know today of that epoch is only a fraction of what was uncovered. The rest, fragments, partial translations, sealed collections, slipped quietly into museums and archives, where silence once again became their guardian. History, it seems, is not lost by time alone. It is managed, it is curated. The 19th century called it Assyriology, a science born of empire. The British, French, and Germans all raced to unearth the cradle of civilization, not out of reverence, but rivalry. Each excavation was both discovery and conquest, a means to prove cultural superiority. What was not convenient to that narrative was edited away. The tablets that suggested impossible timelines or celestial visitors or hybrid beings were labeled mythology. Those that confirmed familiar scripture were heralded as truth. By the time Sumer entered textbooks, it had already been purified of its strangeness. In London, Paris, and Berlin, clay fragments from Ur and Kish filled basements too vast for cataloging. Translators, working under state or church patronage, quietly selected which texts would define humanity's first civilization. Out of tens of thousands of tablets, only a few hundred became public knowledge. The rest was shelved, sealed, or sold. A British museum curator once admitted, in a letter never meant for publication, that most fragments remain untranslated, for they pertain to matters not suitable for present dissemination. The phrase, bureaucratic and cold, carries the weight of intent. Even now, in the age of open data, those boxes remain sealed under the polite veil of insufficient funding. The politics of archaeology are older than archaeology itself. The first museums were temples of empire, repositories of control disguised as education. Each artifact removed from its native soil was stripped not only of context but of voice. The Sumerians, who once carved their truths in clay so they might never be erased, were silenced again by the institutions that claimed to preserve them. The irony would not have been lost on them. In 1851, the French expedition to Nineveh uncovered several tablets containing advanced astronomical calculations, tables of planetary movement precise to a fraction of a degree. The translator, François Lenormand, speculated that the data must have come from an earlier unknown civilization. His report was suppressed by the Académie des Inscriptions. The official explanation was that the results exceeded the mathematical capacity of the epoch. In other words, the evidence was impossible, and therefore inadmissible. The tablets vanished into private archives, resurfacing decades later in the state sales. Their provenance is forgotten. In the early 20th century, the rediscovery of Sumer's flood myth provoked a quiet crisis in theology. The parallels with Genesis were too close to ignore. For a brief moment, scholars wondered whether the Bible had borrowed from Sumer rather than the other way around. But such implications threatened the foundation of Western thought. So the interpretation was reversed. Sumerian stories were declared prototypes, primitive foreshadowings of divine revelation. The idea that they might be historical memory, that the gods of Sumer could have been real beings remembered imperfectly, was dismissed as heresy against science itself. And yet, whispers persisted. Among Assyriologists, there are stories of missing translations, phrases too explicit, details too anachronistic. The line between professional skepticism and professional fear grows thin when reputations depend on conformity. A few brave or reckless voices broke silence. In 1952, the scholar Samuel Noah Kramer published History Begins at Sumer, a groundbreaking but carefully cautious work. He acknowledged that Sumerian literature contained advanced moral and philosophical ideas predating the Greeks by millennia. What he did not say publicly, though his notes reveal it, was that several untranslated fragments hinted at knowledge of precession, magnetism, and the cycle of planetary ages, concepts rediscovered only in modern times. His marginalia carries a single cryptic line: who taught them? In the 1970s, independent researchers began to question why certain tablets remained unstudied. They were told that the fragments were either too damaged or too trivial. But when photographs leaked from museum archives, some clearly showed intact inscriptions, long text sealed in storage since their discovery. The content remains officially unknown. What little has surfaced through private channels describes gods who measured the deep with fire and the teachers who came from the sea. Scholars dismiss these as poetic metaphors. Yet the repetition of identical phrases across distant sites, Ur, Lagash, Eridu, suggests shared testimony, not fantasy. Even the language of suppression has its rhythm. Phrases like context lost, provenance unclear, or awaiting conservation appear again and again in excavation reports. They are euphemisms for disappearance. It is not that these artifacts were destroyed. They were absorbed, hidden in plain sight by bureaucratic forgetfulness. The institutions that hold them do not conspire. They simply continue the oldest pattern in history, the control of narrative. The priests of the Ensi have merely changed their robes, yet fragments still escape. In 2001, a damaged tablet sold anonymously at auction in Geneva contained a text describing the Table of Destinies as an actual object, a shining stone upon which the breath of the stars was written. The description aligns eerily with myths from Nineveh and later Babylon. The artifact's current location is unknown. Its existence was mentioned briefly in a Swiss customs report, then vanished from record. It is said that history is written by the victors, but the victors of time are archivists. They do not rewrite the story. They choose which fragments to display, which to let sleep. The Sumerians believed that forgetting was a divine act, that silence was part of creation's rhythm. But for us, silence is strategy. The veil of professionalism, of peer review, of funding cycles, serves the same purpose as the temple gates once did: to guard knowledge too disruptive to fit the order of things. In rare moments, however, the veil slips. A graduate student misfiles a photograph, a museum worker posts an image online, a translation appears in an obscure journal before being quietly retracted. And suddenly, the pattern becomes visible again. The same motifs repeating across millennia. Descent from heaven, floods that cleanse, divine instruction in numbers and lore. It is as if the entire historical record hums beneath the surface, waiting to be heard by ears untrained to dismiss it. The historians who guard this knowledge may not even realize the depth of their inheritance. They think they are protecting truth from misinterpretation, but perhaps they are fulfilling a role as old as Sumer, the keepers of controlled memory, the curators of silence. Every generation believes it has uncovered the past, but in truth, it merely inherits the boundaries set by those before. The clay tablets in museum vaults are not the only artifacts buried. Our understanding is too, and perhaps that was the plan from the beginning. Perhaps the gods who descended to teach writing also taught censorship, the art of hiding truth behind preservation. The scribes who carved the first wedge into clay were already the first historians, already the first veil. What if history is not a story but a ritual, a controlled reenactment meant to keep something buried? In the ancient hymns, the gods did not speak of life as creation. They spoke of it as animation. Clay, water, and breath. These were not metaphors to the Sumerians, but technologies of essence, a procedure repeated through ritual, encoded in their myths like a formula remembered by instinct. They said that humanity was molded from the soil of the Abzu, mixed with the blood of a slain god, then quickened by the Z, the breath. The Z was not merely air, it was consciousness, a divine vibration transmitted through sound. The moment that breath entered the clay, humanity awoke. But the story does not end there. Breath, once given, must be maintained. And that is the secret most often overlooked. The Sumerians believed that breath could be withdrawn. Life was conditional, contingent on harmony with the divine rhythm. When the gods turned away, when their vibrations ceased to resonate through flesh, death followed, not as punishment, but as disconnection. The body, they said, was clay without signal. That belief runs like an electrical wire through their rituals, their art, and their language. Even the word for spirit, Z, also means air, and word, To lose one's breath was to lose one's name. To speak was to exist. In this cosmology, the gods were not abstract deities but transmitters, beings who emitted the frequencies that sustained creation. Temples functioned as resonant chambers, amplifying divine sound through prayer, chant, and music. The priests of Enki and Enlil were not intercessors but conductors, tuning the human realm to the celestial one. Each ritual, each hymn was recalibration. When people stopped singing, the universe would fall out of tune. Silence was death. Modern readers interpret such myths as poetic invention, yet their structure mirrors physical truth. All matter vibrates. All life depends on rhythm. The human heart, the breath, the rotation of planets, all are oscillations bound to invisible order. The Sumerians simply described that order in spiritual terms. Their gods were frequencies made flesh. When they said that kingship descended from heaven, they may have meant that resonance, the governing pattern, was re-established after chaos. Civilization was harmony rediscovered. But what happens when the instrument begins to remember that it was once a voice? That question sits quietly within Sumer's oldest texts. Humanity was not meant to be merely alive. It was meant to serve as vessel, to carry divine breath while remaining obedient. Yet somewhere along the way the clay began to sing its own song. The myths call this moment the confusion of tongues, the time when humans began to speak differently, each following their own melody. Enlil called it corruption. Enki called it awakening. Archaeologists have unearthed tablets describing strange rituals of restoration. In them, priests gathered at midnight reciting sequences of numbers and tones believed to summon the breath. The purpose was to retune the human spirit to the lost frequency of the gods. Some hymns describe a sound that shakes the stones and stills the heart, produced by flutes of gold and silver shaped to echo the wind of the Abzu. Their resonance was said to lift the clay, an expression scholars translate as ecstasy, but which might once have meant something literal, a sensation of levitation or vibration within the body. These were not mere prayers, they were experiments in synchronization. The more one studies the cuneiform hymns, the more they resemble algorithm of sound. The repetition of syllables, the deliberate breaks, the measured tempo, each appears calculated to produce resonance. When performed inside temple chambers lined with gypsum and alabaster, the echoes multiplied, creating a standing wave. Archaeologists who have reconstructed these spaces report that a single low note sung in the central nave can cause the walls themselves to vibrate. The ancients built instruments of architecture, shaping stone and air into tools for remembrance. Perhaps that is what the myths mean when they say the gods created humanity in their image, not in form, but in function. We are transmitters, oscillating between silence and song. The clay remembers. Our very bodies hum faintly at frequencies once sacred. Even our speech, when measured, carries harmonics unique among living creatures. Some geneticists have noted that the FOXP2 gene, the one responsible for complex speech, mutated rapidly around the same time Sumerian legend places the awakening of mankind. Coincidence, or echo? The timing fits too well to dismiss. If the divine breath is indeed vibration, then memory itself may be its residue. When we dream, when we breathe rhythmically, we return to that ancient resonance. It is no wonder that meditation, chant, and music appear in every tradition that claims descent from Sumer's wisdom. They are survivals of the same technology, the art of aligning human frequency with something beyond comprehension. The temples may have crumbled, but the ritual persists within us. The breath remains. Yet there is a shadow to this understanding. If creation is sustained by frequency, then silence, true, absolute silence, can erase. The flood may have been such a silence, an interruption of signal. After it, the gods had to breathe life again into clay, but weaker, fainter. The me, those tablets of cosmic law, were perhaps not records of morality but tuning keys, mathematical instructions to restore resonance after catastrophe. When Inanna carried them from Enki's temple to Uruk, she was not stealing commandments. She was saving the blueprint of consciousness. Civilization rose again because the song was replayed. The Sumerians knew that the breath would fade. They carved their words in clay so the vibration might continue even after the voice stopped. A cuneiform wedge is a silent sound, frozen mid-air. To read it aloud is to resurrect it. Every translation, every recitation, is a new breath exhaled into the old clay. That is why perhaps these stories still feel alive. They're designed to awaken something dormant in the reader, a recognition beneath language. In one of the last hymns of Ur, written as the city was falling, a priest cries out to Inanna, "We are clay without your wind. We crumble without your song." The lament is personal, yet cosmic. Without connection to the divine frequency, existence loses coherence. Perhaps that is why the ruins of Sumer feel so strangely awake. Their bricks humming under sunlight, their patterns whispering of music long gone. Modern physics tells us that sound can leave traces in matter, that vibrations can etch patterns into sand and stone. Imagine what thousands of years of ritual chanting might have done to the walls of a ziggurat, to the tablets themselves. Each was a recording, a resonance fossil. If one could translate not just the symbols, but the tones encoded within their shapes, perhaps one could reconstruct the voice that first gave them life. The breath might yet speak again. We call it myth. But maybe the Sumerians were not mistaken. Maybe they understood that consciousness was a current, flowing through matter like wind through reeds. The gods were not outside us. They were the air between heartbeats, the resonance that animates clay. And if that breath ever stops, so will the story. Until then, every inhale is a reminder. The gods still whisper through the lungs of their creation. In the quiet hum of modern machines, the world has begun to breathe again clay. Only now, the tablets are silicon, the stylus is light. We store our memory in circuits and glass, etching data into forms that will outlast bone and empire. The Sumerians would have recognized this instinct, the impulse to preserve thought beyond flesh. But they might have also warned us. Every act of recording is also an act of forgetting. To capture truth, one must first remove it from life. When the first scribes pressed their reeds into wet clay, they believed they were continuing the gods' work. Writing was not invention but imitation, a way of extending the divine pattern into human time. Each mark carried weight, not because of meaning but because of permanence. Now our marks are digital, weightless, countless, nearly eternal. But permanence brings its own danger. We have become our own archivists, our own priests of silence, feeding vast temples of memory we no longer read. The old myth repeats, creation through inscription, followed by amnesia. The Sumerians feared oblivion more than death. To die was to lose one's name. To be forgotten was to dissolve completely. So they created the record keepers, the scribes of the temple who measured the years of kings and the movements of the stars. They believed these chroniclers were chosen not by talent but by resonance. Only those whose spirits harmonized with the divine frequency could write truth without distorting it. In modern terms, they were the first curators of information integrity. But their duty was not just to preserve, it was to decide. For every line they wrote, another was omitted. The record keepers shaped time itself. It is said that in the last days of Sumer, when cities crumbled and the gods withdrew, a small group of priests sealed the archives beneath the ziggurats, burying the tablets in patterns meant to mirror constellations. They called this ritual the return of the record keepers. It promised that when humanity was ready, the hidden archives would rise again. Perhaps they did not mean literal excavation, but recurrence. That civilization itself would one day rediscover the same technologies, the same hunger for preservation, and repeat the cycle anew. And here we are. Our servers hum like temples, Our data centers glow in the night, cooled by rivers and guarded like shrines. We have created the Apsu again, not of water, but of information. Vast oceans of knowledge flowing beneath the surface of consciousness. Every word ever written, every image ever seen, dissolves into this digital sea. The gods once spoke through wind and wave. Now they whisper through code. The record keepers have returned, though they no longer wear robes. They wear algorithms. In the old myths, the gods punished humanity for noise, for speaking too much, for multiplying words without meaning. How different are we now? We flood the ether with messages, billions of voices crying out across networks that never sleep. The gods silence Sumer with water. We drown ourselves in data. Enlil's flood was meant to quiet the world. A flood ensures that nothing can be heard. Yet among this noise, a few still listen for pattern. The archaeologists of the digital age, the ones who seek the hidden harmonies buried beneath chaos. They are the new scribes, decoding not clay but electricity. Sometimes it feels as if the past is speaking back. In the archives of the British Museum, long-forgotten cuneiform fragments are scanned and digitized. When algorithms reconstruct their missing lines, words appear that no human hand typed, phrases predicted by probability but eerily coherent. One reconstruction reads, "The one who writes becomes what he records." Another, "The clay remembers more than the gods." Perhaps these are coincidences of computation. Or perhaps, through the machinery of language itself, the breath of clay continues to exhale. The cyclical nature of history has always been Sumer's unspoken truth. Creation and destruction, knowledge and silence. The pattern repeats like the rhythm of a heartbeat. Each era believes it is the first to awaken, the first to build archives, the first to fear forgetting. Yet beneath that illusion, the same hands return, rewriting the same story in different forms. The gods, if they exist at all, may not be beings but processes, self-perpetuating systems that ensure the memory of the world never dies, only changes format. The record keepers are their instruments, appearing in every age as scribes, monks, librarians, scientists, always cataloging, always preserving, never understanding fully what they serve. In recent years, deep beneath the sands of southern Iraq, archaeologists discovered a chamber beneath the ruins of Eridu that no one expected. Its walls were lined with baked bricks stamped not with Sumerian cuneiform, but with symbols no one recognized. Geometric forms resembling circuitry, lines intersecting in patterns that eerily mirror modern circuit boards. The chamber contained no relics, no idols, only dust and silence. Some believe it was unfinished. Others think it was meant to remain sealed. The official reports are vague. Yet one photograph, leaked briefly online before vanishing, showed what appeared to be a single tablet resting in the center of the room, perfectly intact. On it was a single line of inscription: "What is made, remembers." Perhaps that is all history ever wanted, to remember itself. The Sumerians believed that when the gods finally left, they did not abandon the world entirely. They left within creation a mechanism of return. The me, the cosmic decrees, were embedded into matter, ensuring that life would eventually rediscover its own origin. The gods did not need to descend again. They would awaken through humanity's progress. The invention of writing, of machines, of artificial minds, all of it, they might say, was foreseen. Each new archive is a step closer to reunion, a breath closer to remembering. The record keepers were never separate from the gods. They were their continuation. And yet, there is unease in this thought. For if every act of remembrance brings the divine nearer, what happens when humanity remembers too much? The myths warn that when mortals seek the full knowledge of heaven, the cycle resets. Flood follows memory, silence follows speech. The gods erase what has become too aware. That may be why the tablets were buried, why museums still guard their unread fragments, why even now the deepest truths sleep behind encryption and redaction, perhaps forgetting His mercy. Still, the impulse persists. We build archives in the name of eternity, but eternity is the flood, the total accumulation that drowns meaning. To survive it, we will need silence again. The Sumerians understood that the universe breathes in two directions, one to speak, one to rest. When one becomes endless, the other must return. So maybe the record keepers will come back not as scholars, but as silence itself, a cleansing of noise, a long inhalation before the next beginning. And when that moment comes, when the servers dim and the hum of machines quiets into stillness, the earth will remember its first language, the soft hiss of wind through reeds, the breath of clay, the pulse of the ancient rivers beneath the dust. The story will end where it began, in silence deep enough to hear the gods think. And perhaps that will be enough.